Hey everyone, welcome to a special deep dive. We're tackling the AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator exam.
That's right, and we're diving deep into one of the biggest sections, Manage Azure Identities and Governance. It's a good 15–20% of the exam.
No small chunk.
Yeah.
So, to make this more digestible, we're breaking it down. Kicking things off with Entra ID, what used to be Azure AD. Then on to Azure subscriptions and some cost management must-knows.
Exactly. Think of this as part one of your Azure governance crash course, getting you ready for exam day and beyond.
Love it. I've been feeling a little overwhelmed by how much there is to know, so this structured approach is perfect.
I hear you. It's one thing to memorize facts, but really getting how it all connects in Azure, well, that's the key. That's what we're here for.
Music to my ears. All right, let's jump in. Entra ID, right? It's the core of Azure Identity Management, but man, it can feel like a maze.
Yeah, it's got its twists and turns for sure. Remember, Entra ID is all about managing access users, groups, the whole shebang. And not just for stuff inside Azure either. It covers cloud apps and even outside services like Microsoft 365.
So, like the gatekeeper to all things Azure. If Entra ID says no, you're not getting in.
Precisely. And the exam's going to test you on different parts of it. Think about how you create users and groups. It's not always as easy as clicking Add User. They might hit you with questions about bulk updates using things like CSV files or even PowerShell.
Oh, that reminds me. I had a practice question about the exact permissions needed for creating users in bulk. Totally tripped me up.
Classic exam tactic. They love to see if you know the details. So yeah, technically, you'd need a global admin or user admin role in Entra ID to do that. But in the real world, it's not always so clear-cut. Companies have their own roles and security setups, you know.
So pay close attention to what the exam question's actually asking. Don't overthink it.
You got it.
Yeah.
Think about the ideal scenario within Entra ID. That's what they're looking for. Another big one is managing licenses.
Ugh, licenses. Don't even get me started. So many types. So easy to get lost.
I feel you. And for the AZ-104, you want to know those common ones like Microsoft 365, E3, E5, and Azure AD Premium P1 and P2. They each unlock different features in Azure.
Right, so it's not just knowing they exist, but what each one means, what you get with Premium P2 versus P1, that kind of thing.
You nailed it. Picture this. An exam question asks you to recommend the best licensing option for a company with specific security needs, but they're on a budget. You need to know which license fits the bill without breaking the bank.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those administrative units I keep hearing about?
Ah, yes. Administrative units. Lifesavers for bigger organizations with tons of users and groups. Think of them like departments inside Entra ID. Each one gets its own admins and permissions. It's all about giving control without handing over the keys to the kingdom.
So if the exam asks about giving admin tasks to someone without making them a global admin, administrative units are the way to go.
You got it. Now, how about we switch gears to something super important in Azure, managing costs?
Because no one likes opening their Azure bill to a bunch of surprise charges.
Exactly, and that's where understanding Azure subscriptions comes in. Subscriptions are like your billing containers. They decide how you pay for those Azure services. The exam might ask you to compare different types of subscriptions. You got your free trial, your pay-as-you-go, and even those custom enterprise agreements for the big players.
You know what always trips me up? The whole subscriptions and tenants thing, how those two connect.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental thing to get. Think of your tenant like the main company, and subscriptions are like individual departments under that company, each with their own budget. Each subscription is tied to just one Entra ID tenant. But, and here's the kicker, a single tenant can have multiple subscriptions.
So if we imagine a company with a bunch of different departments, each department might have its own subscription, but they all fall under the same main company that's the Entra ID tenant.
Exactly. Now you're thinking like the examiners want you to think. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Azure identities and governance. So we've laid the groundwork, Entra ID, Azure subscriptions, all that good stuff. But now we got to talk RBAC, role-based access control.
Okay, RBAC, it sounds kind of intense, like a secret agent thing. Seriously though, why is it such a big deal in Azure?
Control and security, that's what it's all about. Those users and groups we set up in Entra ID, RBAC decides what they can actually do with that access. Like who gets to touch what in your Azure world?
So it's kind of like having a library card doesn't mean you can just walk out with every book. You can log into Azure, but RBAC says what you're allowed to actually mess with.
Spot on, and the exam is going to throw RBA scenarios at you left and right. You got to know those built-in roles. Owner, contributor, reader, the gang's all here. Owners, well, they can do it all. Contributors can manage things, but they can't give access to others. And readers, pretty self-explanatory. They can only look, not touch.
Okay, makes sense. But what if those built-in roles aren't specific enough? What if I need more, like, granular control over what someone's allowed to do?
Ah, you're thinking like a pro. That's where custom roles come in. Big-time exam favorite, and for good reason. Custom roles let you get super specific, tailoring permissions to exactly what your organization needs.
Okay, so instead of making someone a full-on contributor, I could create a custom role that only lets them restart virtual machines. Again, delete them, just restart them.
You got it. That's the power of custom roles. You're not stuck with those preset options. You can get as detailed as you need to.
Okay, starting to see how powerful RBAC is. But you mentioned something before about scope. What's that all about in the RBAC world?
Scope. Super important for RBAC. Remember that pyramid structure we talked about?
Refresh my memory. Which pyramid are we talking about again?
Right. At the top, it's management groups that can cover loads of subscriptions. And below that, you've got subscriptions, then your resource groups, and finally, the individual resources themselves. This is how permissions flow down.
So if I give someone the contributor role at the subscription level, they automatically get those same permissions for every resource group and resource within that subscription.
Bingo. It's like a permission waterfall flowing down the pyramid. And this is where the exam might try to trip you up.
Oh no, trip me up. Give me an example so I'm ready.
Okay, let's say you need to let someone restart virtual machines, but that's it, nothing else. Making them a contributor at the subscription level, that's way too much power, right? Instead, you'd whip up a custom role with just that restart permission and apply it at the resource group level just for those VMs.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, enough access to get the job done, but not opening up the whole candy store.
Exactly. And just to make it even more fun, remember there are actually two types of roles to keep straight. Entra ID roles and RBAC roles.
Wait, hold up. Two different types. You're really testing my memory now.
It's not as bad as it sounds. Entra ID roles, they're all about managing users and groups inside Entra ID. Think user creation, assigning licenses, those administrative units, all that internal stuff. RBAC roles, on the other hand, they're focused on who gets to access what Azure resources, your virtual machines, storage accounts, and the like.
So Entra ID roles are like the HR department, and RBAC roles are the actual department managers.
Perfect analogy. And here's where it gets spicy. Some roles can actually be both.
Whoa, hold on. Two hats at once.
You got it. Take the User Access Administrator role in Entra ID. This role actually lets you manage who can access stuff within Azure resources too.
So it's like an HR manager who also gets to call the shots in other departments.
You got it. The big takeaway. Pay close attention to what the exam question is really asking. Are they talking about managing users inside Entra ID, or is it about controlling access to specific Azure stuff? That'll tell you what kind of role you're dealing with.
Oh, well, we've gone deep on Entra ID and RBAC. It's amazing how much goes into managing users and permissions in Azure. But something tells me we're not done yet.
You know it. We've covered who can access what, but now let's talk about enforcing those rules across your entire Azure world. Like, no matter who's building what, everyone's following the same playbook.
Okay, I like where this is going. Azure can feel a bit like the Wild West sometimes, so some law and order sounds good to me.
And our sheriff in this case is Azure Policy. Think of it as your automated governance superhero, making sure all your Azure resources are in line.
Superhero, huh? Okay, now you're speaking my language. What kind of superpowers are we talking about here?
Azure Policy is all about enforcing those rules at scale. Imagine you need every single virtual machine to be deployed in specific regions, data residency, all that. Azure Policy makes sure it happens. Or maybe you want to stop people from using certain services that get pricey. Azure Policy can handle that too. It's all about setting those boundaries you mentioned.
So no one goes off-roading in the Azure world, even by accident.
Exactly. And just like RBAC, we've got that concept of scope here. Remember, you apply policies at different levels to get things just right. You might have policies for an entire management group covering a bunch of subscriptions to keep everything consistent. Or get more specific and apply them at the resource group level, or even to a single resource.
Let's say I want to stop anyone from creating a virtual machine outside of our approved regions. I can set an Azure policy that just shuts that down no matter who tries.
You got it. That's Azure Policy giving you control and consistency. And here's a little exam gold. Azure Policy doesn't just block stuff that doesn't comply. It can also fix things that are already non-compliant.
Fix them. like automatically.
Yep. You can go with automatic remediation, Azure Policy plays the cleanup crew, or you can have it notify you about the issue so you can handle it manually.
That is cool. Okay, Azure Policy is definitely earning its superhero badge.
It's a powerful one for sure. And there's more. Remember those tags we talked about? Great for organizing and tracking costs? Well, guess what? They also play a part in how Azure Policy does its thing.
Hold on, tags and Azure Policy are teaming up now. You're blowing my mind.
They go together like peanut butter and jelly. You can actually write those tags directly into your Azure Policy rules. Like a policy could say it only applies to resources with a specific tag. Or it could demand a certain tag is on every resource, making your governance even more fine-tuned.
So tags are like the secret ingredient that unlocks Azure Policy's full potential.
Exactly. When you use tags in your policy rules, you get this amazing flexibility, and in the cloud world, that's key.
Wow, this has been amazing. From Entra ID Basics to RBAC and now Azure Policy with its tag team partner, I feel like I'm finally cracking the code on Azure identities and governance.
And that's exactly what you want going into the AZ-104, but remember, we've covered a ton. The real magic happens when you get your hands dirty in the Azure portal.
So true. The more you play around, the more confident you'll be. To everyone listening, open up that Azure portal and start experimenting. Create some users, test out those RBAC roles, see what Azure Policy can do, and don't forget those resource logs.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's been great diving deep with you all. Until next time, happy studying.